A little to do with the systemic approach to human problems. However, I would like to make it clear that I'm going to talk about interventions, and I'm only going to present intervention as such, and sometimes you may have the impression that this is totally individual monadic therapy. I would like to emphasize that when I begin to give an intervention, I have already seen as much of the immediate system that is involved in this problem, and therefore my intervention already is based on what I think I have understood of the functioning of this particular system. I think that without this warning, you may at times have really the feeling that this is purely old-fashioned individual monadic therapy. The title may even emphasize or may make this suspicion even stronger. The title, as you know, is Hypnotherapy without Trance. And there doesn't seem to be a type of therapy that is more individual and less systemic than hypnotherapy. What I would like to show to you are certain interventions, certain techniques that were developed in the field of hypnotherapy over long periods of time, but which can also be taken over into our type of therapy and need not be, and they are not limited to trance. Even so, however, may I ask how many of you are using hypnosis or have had training in hypnosis? Just very few, actually, yes. That's an advantage. Now, those of you who already do hypnosis, of course, will not be surprised by my pearls of wisdom. But and Keith, I'm going to talk about certain techniques that you can take over from the field of hypnotherapy, and that can be used outside the very restricted area of trance work. I'm sure you know that hypnotherapy has always been the enfant terrible of classical hypnotherapy. Because on the one hand, its successes, its usefulness, its power is undeniable. On the other hand, however, it seems to contradict many of the basic assumptions, many of the supposed truths of classical traditional therapy. It had only one place, really, in classical therapy, and that was as a vehicle, as an instrument, as a technique to get at repressed material. It is possible under hypnosis to have somebody regress to earlier parts of his life, and a good hypnotic subject then does very surprising things. They begin to talk, for instance, with a very infantile voice, a childlike voice, and they begin to remember things that they couldn't remember otherwise. So the usefulness of this application for the purpose of getting at repressed material is undeniable. But precisely the technique of getting at repressed material is not what we try to do in systemic therapy. In systemic therapy, as I'm sure you have now heard over and over again, we do not ask why. Why does this person here behave in this irrational, ill-adapted fashion? What are the causes in the past? It seems to me that in systemic therapy we ask what for. Because you see, the moment we ask why, we are forcing ourselves to go back into the past, whether we know it or not. To find an answer to the question why, it requires to go back into the past. On the other hand, if I'm interested in the system here and now, the why has very little importance. How the situation came about that I'm now trying to do something with or about is of no importance. What is important to us is to understand how this system works in the here and now. And therefore, if we're up against what might be called pathological behavior, we need to understand how it fits into the functioning of the system, how it itself contributes to the homeostasis basis to the maintenance of the particular system equilibrium, the homeostasis. So therefore the question that I ask myself is not why does he behave in this fashion, but what for? And one of the questions that I find extremely useful is to discuss, to ask with my clients, what would you have to face if, by sheer miracle, at the end of this session, your problem were resolved? And I want your answer number 2, because your answer number 1, I know, and I don't believe it. And people then sit there and think and say, well, if the problem were resolved, we would all be happy and everything would be all right. And then I say, well, that's answer number 1. So what would you really have to face once this problem is resolved? What's behind it? What has this problem so far concealed, so that you couldn't see what's behind it? This is my way of trying to get an answer to the question of what for. What is the function of the present situation? So please don't jump to wrong conclusions if in the course of this presentation this morning I'm at times probably going to give you the impression that I'm dealing exclusively with one person, which is not meant to be so, and I think in every single one of the cases I would like to present, I could tell you, if you want to know, the wider context in which this particular intervention occurred. Sometimes I do work with single individuals, but as I said a minute ago, it is only after I think I have obtained a fairly clear idea of what's going on in the here and now. Then I may indeed choose one of the subsystems of that system, especially if that particular person seems to be the most likely one to carry out a particular behavior prescription. And this need not be the identified patient, needless to say. Especially in troubles with teenagers, we would always prefer to or try to concentrate on the parents. This I already mentioned also. If you go to a congress of hypnotherapy, you will always be given a complicated, by every speaker, you will be given a complicated hypothesis about what hypnosis really is. So let me do the same thing, except leave out the word really, and say, it seems to me that hypnosis is a very interesting and useful and powerful way to get people to behave as if something were the case. That isn't the case, clearly. You see, if I induce a trance in a person, if a person has the hand, I'm sure that the elbow is on the armrest of the chair and the hand hangs down, and then I begin to give the suggestion, and gradually you will notice that your left hand is getting lighter and lighter, and gradually you will have a feeling that your left hand is beginning to rise up into the air. In 90% of the cases, this now begins to take place. To the utter amazement of the subject, the hand is beginning to go up. Now, needless to say, I haven't made the hand lighter than air through my suggestions. Needless to say, here is some kind of a strange mental phenomenon that makes the person experience his own lifting the hand as something that he doesn't do, that the hand itself does. In other words, the person, this is my interpretation please, it's not a scientific fact. In my interpretation, the person behaves as if the hand were getting lighter and lighter. For the subject, this is very, very impressive, because here something is taking place indeed. And then, following Spiegel, I may even say, and I'm now going to push your hand back down to where it was before, and when I do this, it will be against your resistance, and when I let go, your hand will come back up again where it is, and then I go like this, and the hand comes back up. And then I know I'm in business now. So, linking up with my presentation the other day, when I talked about, remember the philosophy of as if, I would like to present to you today some hints about a therapy of as if. Remember Feihinger in his book, The Philosophy of as if, talks about his assumption that we always work with fictions. And it seems to me that this is a very nice fiction. Your left hand is getting lighter and lighter is such a fiction. It is totally fictitious, yet it has a concrete result. And about these results that can be obtained in this kind, by using these kinds of techniques, even outside of the field of trance, I would like to present to you a number of these interventions. First of all, you may already have had the experience of being asked by some person who knows little or nothing about therapy, how come that mere talking can bring about a change? And this is not a totally stupid question, because until about, 40 years ago, even scientists had their doubts that talking had any kind of behavioral effect. I once read about a very interesting, for me, very interesting experiment that Emperor Frederick the Great, back in the 14th century, is supposed to have undertaken. The emperor wanted to know what language is the innate, the God-given language of men. Latin, Greek, or Hebrew. And for this purpose, he had a group of newly born infants raised by nurses who had strict orders not to talk in the presence of the children or to the children. So by creating this linguistic vacuum, the emperor hoped to be able to find out if they now would begin one of the three languages. This would then be, of course, the original language of men. The emperor's chronicler, Fra Salimbene di Parma, reports on this experiment by saying era fatica vana perché i piccoli morivano tutti. It was useless, it was lost pain because the little ones all died. 6 centuries later, over 6 centuries later, Werner Spitz, with his investigations of hospitalism and marasm, gave modern confirmation to this fact, i.e. that apparently we cannot survive in a world in which there is no interaction, no communication. The hermits who lived out in the grottos in the desert and fed on locusts are gone, if they ever existed, which I doubt. For the same reason, the story of Kaspar Hauser is totally unbelievable by our present view of things. Hauser, as you may remember, turned up around it must have been Napoleonic days, 1820, 1830, I don't know. He turned up in Nuremberg with an anonymous letter of recommendation to the authorities. And he said, he claimed to be about 16 years old, and he also claimed that as far back as he can remember, he had always been kept in a dark cubicle. He had never seen anybody. The food had been passed to him under the door, and so that's all he knew, he claimed. So he remained a mystery, and he became the object of many, many sort of very, very interesting theories about his life and his fate and so on. He returned home 3 years after his appearance. He returned home with several stab wounds that some unknown assailant had inflicted upon him, and died within a few days. And the mystery was never resolved. By our present state of knowledge about the effects of human communication, the story is totally unbelievable. nobody could have survived, no child could have survived under the circumstances that he described. So when we communicate, when we enter into communication, we form a systemic situation in which, as I tried to show in my introduction 2 weeks ago, an emergent quality then arises, something that is more than and different from the properties that the single individuals bring into this relationship. And this is where the interesting part begins. In other words, it is possible through certain forms of communications to bring about changes, positive or negative ones. The most important negative ones were first studied by the Bateson group back in the 1950s. The Bateson group, among many other things that they did, began to study the communication that goes on in the families of so-called schizophrenics. And Bateson found that in the interaction in these family systems, paradoxical messages that have the structure of classical paradox, are particularly frequent. These are messages that create situations that are considered or called untenable. They create a situation in which usually there are only two possibilities open, but both possibilities, both courses of action are forbidden, wrong, are being criticized, etc. So a person who is in a double bind, as the Bateson group called these types of messages, is damned if he does and damned if he doesn't. And as you may remember, one of the most revolutionary papers of the Bateson group was the double bind paper towards a theory of schizophrenia, it is called. And it created quite a stir in our field, and it is still greatly debated. But anyway, there's a lot we can learn from this, because as the Bateson group also showed, there are not only pathogenic double binds that create totally untenable situations, but there are also therapeutic double binds, and these are the ones I would like to mention, because in hypnosis we use a great deal of therapeutic double binds, as I hope to be able to make clear a little later. Now, the two things we need to bear in mind as we begin to look in this direction. First of all, our language changes. Needless to say, the language of hypnosis is no longer an indicative language. It is not a language of description, explanation, interpretation. It is injunctive, as I've tried to point out in the introduction. It is injunctive. It is a language that says do such and such, or behave in a certain way. Specifically, behave as if such and such were the case. And the second thing is, of course, that under those circumstances we are no longer interested, I'm repeating myself, I know, but we are no longer interested in the question why. We are interested in effects and not in causes. Let me give you some, perhaps a bit hypothetical examples of double-bind communications. Imagine that a professor asks the student, tell me, is the following sentence true or false? The sentence being, the King of France is bald. Is this true or false? Huh? You don't know, then you will not pass my course. If you don't know, you have to know. You see, this is one of those typical situations. I have created a situation in which you are supposedly required to answer, to give the correct answer. But there are only two possibilities, true or false. Either it is true, or it is false, that the King of France is bald. It is a classical example of one of those double-binding messages. Because the Aristotelian dichotomy of true and false simply breaks down here. And paradox can be considered to be the pathology of Aristotelian logic. Or take the example of the judge, the well-known joke about the judge who asks the defendant, have you stopped beating your wife? Answer yes or no. And he threatens him with a contempt of court charge if he says he can't answer yes or no because he has never beaten his wife. So these were examples of such double-binding messages. Or take the example of, I think I mentioned this already, a person who goes into a stationery shop at the beginning of December, buys a box of Christmas cards, and asks the salesgirl to gift wrap the box. Can you see the impossibility there, the paradox there? Obviously, Christmas cards are supposed to be sent out individually before Christmas. On the other hand, if you wrap a box with a wrapping, gift wrapping, it is supposed to be a Christmas gift. But who, in his right mind, would give somebody as a Christmas gift a box of Christmas cards? Now, the most frequent appearance, I could now, and I don't want to waste your time, but we could now, if you wanted to, let's discuss the three most important double binds that we can identify in human interaction as they relate to schizophrenia, to depression, and to antisocial behavior. But let me mention the one that is really very, very frequent in human interchange and interaction, and that is the message, be spontaneous. And we already talked about this, right? We talked about it in two connections. One, the example of the husband whose wife says to him, years ago you used to bring me flowers. Now for a long time you never brought me any flowers. And she expresses a understandable wish for a sign of affection. What she doesn't know is that in saying this, she has now created a paradoxical situation, an untenable situation. There are only two possibilities under the circumstances, as I already pointed out. The husband can either continue not to bring her flowers, in which case she will be disappointed, because it disregards her wish. Or he now brings her flowers, in which case she's going to say, or at least to think, well, thank you, but you only brought them because I had to remind you. You see, under the circumstances, there is no way out. We've asked ourselves how much time would have to pass until the husband now can bring her flowers without her saying, well, yes, but you're doing the right thing for the wrong reason, so to speak. You could bring her a box of chocolates. That would already be a way out of it. So, let me go back now and talk about the positive applications of these very pathogenic kind of interventions and interactions between people that would not be necessarily interventions. As I said, hypnosis, as I see it, and I use it quite a bit, is a way of asking people to behave as if something were the case. And in behaving as if it were the case, it becomes the case, it becomes reality. You have changed the reality construction of that particular group of people. So let me now get into my list of techniques that one can take over directly from the field of hypnotherapy. First of all, Erickson has always insisted on the need to learn and to use the patient's language. This is how he put it. This is a total departure from the classical model of therapy where, as you know, a large part of a long time is wasted at the beginning of therapy, wasted in my mind, in the effort to teach your clients a new language, i.e. the language of the particular school of therapy that the therapist subscribes to. One gets the client to begin to think of himself and of his life and of his problem and so on in terms of that particular theory of therapy. And once the person begins to see himself, herself, in these terms, once this linguistic frame has been created, change is then attempted within the confines of this frame. This takes a long time. In hypnosis we don't do this. In hypnosis, as I just mentioned, we learn and we use the client's language. We listen very carefully. First of all, talking strictly about hypnosis only as an example. When we do hypnosis, before we try to induce a trance, we listen already very carefully how the person expresses him, herself. There are three main types of people who reveal themselves through the use of their language. First of all, the largest group are the visualizers. These are people who are very good at daydreaming, imagining things. And they reveal themselves in the way they express themselves. They say, for instance, I can't see this. Or this event opened my eyes. Or you may ask them, what kind of a person is your mother? And they give you an almost photographic description of what she looks like, which may not be exactly what you had in mind. So this is how they reveal themselves. The second largest group are the people who experience reality mostly through their body sensations. They will use expressions like, this gives me the creeps, I have butterflies in my stomach, and this stuck in my throat. Expressions of that kind. When you hear somebody use this kind of language, you know you are up against somebody, a person belonging to the group that is variously called the proprioceptive people or the visual, sometimes also the kinesic people. I don't quite know why, but I run into this term. Now, clearly, when I do hypnosis, it would be nonsense to try to suggest visual images to a person who belongs to the second group. What happens is, they come out of their trance eventually and they say, you know, this was very pleasant, I feel very, very relaxed, but I couldn't see a single one of the things you mentioned to me. It is nonsense. I have not taken into account my client's language. There's a small third group, and I have so far run only, I think, maybe twice in all my life. And those are the acoustic types. These are people who somehow hear the world more than see or feel it. With these people in hypnosis, usually they're very interested in music. And I would, under those circumstances, I would ask them, what is your favorite, what comes to mind as your favorite piece of music? And all willing, they say something like the third Rachmaninoff concerto or something. And then I know where I am. And I may then use this in my induction. But the point is this. This rule, learn and speak the patient's language, also holds outside the confines of just hypnotherapy. You will find that you get much farther, much quicker, if you listen carefully to the way people express themselves. Because in the way they express themselves, they give you a feeling of the reality that they have constructed for themselves. And that's important. Take the often quoted case of the overprotective mother. Now, everybody has told this woman, stop infantilizing your 17-year-old. You can't be his alarm clock and his conscience and his I don't know what for the rest of his life. He has to become independent. He has to fall on his nose if necessary. It's very useful. He has to become responsible. She has heard this from her husband, from her other children, from her own parents, from the probation officer, from the priest, from the lawyer, from the school psychologist. she doesn't want to hear it from you too. This woman only speaks and only understands the language of maternal sacrifice. So you see how I take over from the strict hypnotherapeutic principles. I go into the wider frame of general psychotherapy. I try to learn and to speak the client's language. To this lady that I just mentioned, I may say, well, you have certainly tried very, very hard. No doubt. But even greater sacrifices may now be required. Now she listens. I'm speaking her language. This is by no means my invention, please. If you read it up, both Aristotle and Socrates, I think, in their respective books on rhetoric already mentioned this. Aristotle says, if you want to convince somebody, use their own arguments. He gives us some very nice examples of immediate applicability to our field. I remember in one occasion I was doing couple therapy, and he was an engineer, and you already can imagine who she was. She was a woman who was at ease with her feelings, and she found him terribly cold and unfeeling and not in touch with his emotions. And in the session she had again attacked him for being so cold and so close-minded. And he sat there and looked up to the ceiling. So I turned to her first and I said, yes, I guess you're right. I mean, it's not so easy for a man to be as much at ease with one's feelings as most women are. And then I turned to him and I said, I think this is a situation where presumably some negative feedback loops will have to be exchanged by some positive feedback loops. And it may even be necessary to introduce a step function here. And he started smiling and said, now you're talking my language. So I can't overestimate the importance of talking the client's language. If you talk to a father who is a rebellious teenager, the father may be absolutely convinced that only very strict and even stricter discipline and authority will get the boy to behave. Of course, as we see, look at this interaction, this system from the outside, we can clearly notice that the more he does by way of disciplining, the more rebellious the son becomes. But that they cannot see, of course, neither of them can see this. Now, we have to get the father to change radically, to change his direction by 180 degrees. But how do you do this? In the reality construction of this man, the only possible reasonable thing to do is to So one may try and find a language that is acceptable to him. And this may be the language of military discipline. So to this father I may be talking in terms of the drill sergeant who has to get the recruits to become real soldiers. And I may take it from there and then gradually change it. So I repeat, I can hardly overemphasize the importance of learning and speaking the patient's language. Interrupt me, please. I'm going on to point number 2, so if you have questions, comments or something, by all means, speak up. Otherwise it's again a one-way street. All right. Colleagues who begin to use this kind of brief therapy model that we have developed, or similar ones, very often are discouraged because even though they are convinced that the intervention they made, the behavior prescription they gave their clients were appropriate, clients come back and say, They may say they have forgotten about doing this, or on second thought it seemed silly, or they have it turns out they have totally misunderstood what you wanted them to do. And again, this has in part, at least, to do with the language. You see, what our colleagues very often who start using this model very often do is they have a clear idea in their heads already what they want now, the kind of change, the kind of as-if behavior that they want their clients to engage in. And since it is so clear in their heads, they put it into one, maybe two short sentences. And then are disappointed when people come back and either they've forgotten it, as I say, or have misunderstood it or something. It seems to me extremely necessary and therefore useful to give the prescription in a slow, monotonous kind of a language, an almost hypnotic form of language, gradually leading up to what you really want to say, but then backing off and approaching the same subject from another side, thereby creating a state of expectation so that when you eventually give the prescription, it sticks. It is much more likely to be understood and carried out than if you just mention it sort of in a very intellectual fashion. And then, so that is another rule that you can directly take over from hypnotherapy. Because in hypnosis we use this slow, repetitive, monotonous kind of language. A third point that again I think has great importance is the following. In hypnotherapy, in hypnosis, we avoid negations. We avoid what in English linguistics are called N-words. No, not, nobody, nowhere, never. There is a plausible paleolinguistic hypothesis why this is so. Apparently, in the development of human language, which is digital language, a language that I am using except for my gestures, the negation came relatively late. Apparently, negation is a relatively recent acquisition of human language. Animals who only communicate with analogic language do not have negations. An animal cannot signal, I will not attack you. The animal can very well signal, I will attack you. If I'm a dog, I growl and I bare my fangs and I crouch. And that clearly means, I'm going to attack. But the dog could not, if he wanted to, he could not signal, I will not attack you. Randy Bateson speculated that the only way an animal could perhaps get the point across is by going through the behaviors that imply attack and then not carry it out. This might be the only way an animal can convey the idea of not. The same holds for picture language. There is no not in anything drawn, painted. If there were a blackboard here, and if I could draw, which I cannot, I could draw something on the blackboard, and if I asked you what does this mean, you would probably say, well, it means there's a cat sitting on a chair. Because I've drawn a chair with a cat sitting on it, all right? But I could not, under any circumstances, no matter how I try, I could not draw something that to you would mean unequivocally, the cat does not sit on the chair. Try it. How would you go about it? I could draw a chair and a cat sitting on the floor. Well, you would then say, well, you have drawn a chair and a cat. Or, I mean, there's no way in which this can be represented in a picture. You see, many of the traffic signs, for instance, are of an analogic nature. But there too, the not cannot be presented analogically. It has to be, for instance, the X. No barking is an X. But the X is already a digital element. It's part of our written language, so to speak. Educators know about this. Educators know that if you are far more likely to get a child to carry out a request if you put it in positive terms. Instead of saying, don't forget to mail this letter, you should say, remember to mail this letter. There's something about negation that doesn't come through. Occasionally, very occasionally, I'm asked to do some hypnotic work in the recovery room. The recovery room, as you know, is where patients who have been operated on are taken, and they arrive there, and they still are under full anesthesia, and therefore, for all intents and purposes, are in a trance. In that case, it is incidentally very simple to give some suggestions. Client knows that you will be there, so you sit there, and I begin to whisper certain things into their ear. For instance, if I want to avoid, as you know, some people are likely to throw up as a result of the general anesthesia, especially Demerol is used, for instance. Some people are allergic to it, and then they have to vomit. Now, I imagine, thank God I've never had the experience, I imagine if you get abdominal surgery and you have to vomit, this must be extremely painful. So how do you go about conveying the idea, trying to block this urge to vomit? If one were to commit the mistake under those circumstances, to give the client the suggestion, you will not have to vomit. In the regressed state in which they are in, the message is you will have to vomit. So it's exactly the opposite that you want to achieve. So you have to put it, to couch it into a kind of a positive language. What might that be? Well, I say, for instance, and an hour after you are back up in your room, you will have a pleasant sensation of appetite. And you may ask the nurse for a glass of fruit juice. Now you see, the suggestion of a pleasant sensation of appetite contradicts the idea of nausea. So I'm trying to block it that way. Or, you know, there's an amazing sort of amazing things that you can do under those circumstances. But you have to avoid the negation. And you avoid negation in hypnosis, because what comes through is the very opposite, because the negation in the regressed state of hypnosis does not come through. There's only one exception to which I have not yet found a solution. I do a lot of work with smokers, and I have not yet found a positive definition of you will not smoke. That is the only exception that I know of. Again, this can be taken over into our field in general. I have stopped using negations, and this means also that I have stopped using criticism, which is in a form of negation. It negates the other person's worth or whatever, self-esteem. So even in the face of the most counterproductive behavior, I will not say, well, what do you expect? You do this, and of course you get that result. Well, something like this. No, I may say again, clearly you have made great efforts. Unfortunately, they have not yet the desired result. Let's see if together we can come up with something additional. I don't even say something else. I say something additional, because this is not offensive. This is something that is now coming to be added on to what the person has already been doing. Questions? Yes, please.
When you talk about negations, you cover all kinds of negations? Like, by example, words like without?
Without, I would have to think. I think it would depend on the context. Yes, you are right. In a sense, without is a negation. Yes. I may perhaps say free from. That's a positive way of putting it.
You would avoid all kinds of words
Yeah.
without.
I would avoid that, yes. But you see, it makes these kind of, I don't know, maybe I'm boring you because I'm very interested in linguistics and I'm interested in languages, and for me, every single case is a new challenge, is a new language I'm trying to learn. So forgive me if I insist a bit too much on it perhaps. All right, let me go on. Yes.
If I could ask are you saying then that if I say to you, I'm not angry, would you think, well now, you take the not out, she is angry?
No, not in a state of non-trance.
Okay, so you're talking about
Yes.
the trance, okay.
No. But I extend it to criticism in general. Why did you do this? And what do you expect? Or something like this. So I know it's a bit of a conceptual jump from a straightforward negation to the idea of negating something indirectly through criticism. Do I make myself clear?
Yes.
Yeah.
You mentioned the three classes, the visualizers and the acoustic and sensation type.
Yes.
Does that pretty much cover all cases?
As far as I know, yes, but there may well be people, but I wouldn't know how, really.
There's no pure types.
But,
There's no pure types.
no, there are no pure types, needless to say, but they are predominant. I mean, I'm a visualizer, for instance. But needless to say, I also feel comfort or discomfort in my body as I lie there and try to hypnotize myself, etc. Yes, but
One thing you said that the visualizers were the largest group, and
yes. The other, as far as I know, as far as people seem to agree that the visualizers are the largest group, yes.
it doesn't hold cross-culturally though, and I was just going to give an example that in the Maori population in New Zealand who have been for centuries before the white man came, based on oral history, they're very much more tuned and much more likely to be acoustic and auditory to
Oh, I see,
sound.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Sound.
It must also hold for certain tribes in Africa that communicate over vast distances by drums.
Yeah.
So of necessity, they must be acoustically much more aware than I am, for instance.
But just have an example. I know a young blind man, and although he's blind, it appeared very strange to me when people around don't really notice and they say, you see this and that happen, you see such and so on and so forth. And the young man, though he's blind, answers, oh yes, I see, and you know, and he carries on with the sentences.
I wonder if he merely took over the verbal style that includes I see. If, on the other hand, you see, people who lose their eyesight after they have been seeing normally, you are in a very different situation, needless to say. People who are congenitally blind, I know very little about. I've often asked myself, do they have dreams? Because a dream usually is a mostly a visual phenomenon, is it not? I don't know.
Yeah, they dream in sensations.
The dream and sensations, that must be it, yes. Yes. Yes.
I didn't quite understand why there's no positive phrasing for you will not smoke, if you can do, for example, the generalization from you will not drink or you will not use cocaine.
Well, that goes, that's the same thing.
Oh, okay, so
Yes.
they're all the addictions.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
That you smoking is.
Is it possible or thinkable that if one is a visualizer, that one can change into acoustic, or is it a history one has and is not to change?
I think I don't know. I don't even know if anybody has studied this sort of thing. I don't know. I know that music entered into my life relatively late. I was about 14 or so. Classic music. But that doesn't mean that I couldn't have been an acoustic type already since age 1. I don't know. I don't know how it works. All right, let me go on to people to drink our coffee and eat our donuts. Have they arrived? Take a look if there's somebody I chased them away, yes? Then what we do use a great deal in hypnosis, following Erickson, is we use a great deal of stories, of metaphorical things, of jokes even. And again, this I believe has immediate applicability also to non-trance therapeutic work. We are all trained to give scientific interpretations of something. In my mind, they are much less useful and effective than a story. And there are, in English, there are at least 20 books out by a man whom I don't know. His name is Idris Shah, S-C-H-A-H, I believe. And they all contain Oriental and other stories. And many of them are very useful in therapy if you want to get a point across, rather than to give a sort of a dreary psychological interpretation or something. You can tell your clients a story. For instance, suppose for a moment you want to get a point across that in many moments in life it is simply necessary to forego, to renounce an immediate gratification, because the consequences of this gratification may far outweigh the pleasure of the gratification. It is what Freud called the reality versus the pleasure principle. Now, yes, the people would listen to me and say, oh, yes, and something. It is much more useful at times to tell the following stories. In certain areas, in certain tropical areas in Africa, they catch monkeys. And you know how they catch them? They take a coconut shell, they make a hole into it that is just big enough for the monkey to slip in his hand. And into the coconut shell, into the empty shell, they put the monkey's favorite nut or something. And then they tie the shell to the tree or to a branch. The monkey comes and notices, aha, here's something to eat. And he goes into the coconut shell and he grabs the thing. And now, holding that thing, he can't get his hand out anymore of the shell. In order to free himself, he would have to let go, and then he would go out. But this, in his greed, he cannot do. So then the hunters come and throw a net over him, and now he's caught. Now he has to let go, but it's too late. I think maybe this sounds like a silly example to you, but this sort of story can have a far greater effect on your clients than some very scientific, cerebral interpretation of something. And of course, if you know stories, and many stories, and especially many very good jokes, and Jewish jokes especially are just marvelous. They all deal with some life situation that is mishandled by the person. So puns, metaphors, and even seeming slips of the tongue, deliberate slips of the tongue, can convey much more of a meaning than something very digital. And then there is a technique that again already Aristotle knew and wrote about. He calls it preempting. And preempting is a particular form of using the expected arguments that you are likely to get. As I mentioned already, Aristotle says if you want to convince somebody, use their own arguments. So an example of preempting would be, if I were to say, there are of course people who would say, who would think such and such, and I mention the very thing that I suspect my client will say. Then, to use perhaps a more convincing example, if you want to get a point across, of which you have reason to believe that the family isn't going to like it or isn't going to accept it very readily, yet you want to say it, you are on far safer grounds if you introduce that very thing by saying, I would like to mention something, but I'm almost certain you're going to find this stupid. I have yet to find somebody who then told me, yes, this really sounds stupid. In a way, you have preempted the criticism, and people are likely to say, no, it doesn't sound stupid to me. They may still have their objections, mind you, but you are on safer grounds. If the two of you were not such intelligent people, I would probably point to the triviality of your problem. How's that? And then there is another thing that Aristotle again calls saying something without saying it. I use this in couple therapy, family therapy. I may, again, want to get a point across of which I have reason to believe that one family member is going to object to it very much, but still, for some reason, I want to say it. Then I may say, for instance, I may turn to the wife and I may say, if your husband weren't here, I would now say the following. And I say it. And it creates a weird kind of situation. One husband once said, but you just said it. And I said, oh yes, you're right, I just said it. But you know, it's getting a point across in a less offensive way, in a way that creates less of a resistance. Question? Let's go on. My next point is the so-called unresolved remnant. Unresolved rest or unresolved remnant. It's an Ericksonian term, and it refers to the fact that in hypnosis we never shoot for total change, total remission, total solution. In hypnotherapy we always imply a small change. You will sleep a few minutes longer. You will be a little less scared to ride in an elevator. Messages of this kind. Yes?
A little less. Wouldn't that be too much using negatives?
No, less I would not call it. It's less of much, I mean. Yeah. So, it has two advantages. First of all, you can never be totally wrong. No? That's an advantage to you. But it is also a respectful thing as far as your clients are concerned, because you are giving them a chance to go beyond what you seem to think they are capable of. So it leaves it open for them to go farther than you have implied. So, as I say, we never say that and this thing will never recur, or you will never have this problem again, or some silly thing like that. Another thing that you learn very quickly when you do hypnosis is the handling of resistance. We've all been trained, at least I believe so, you too, I certainly have been trained to believe that resistance, or negative transference as it was called in my days, is no obstacle to change, to successful therapy. But over and beyond this, I have never been told what to do with resistance. I found out when I got training in hypnosis. In hypnosis, we do not oppose resistance. We prescribe the resistance. For instance, in hypnosis, you get, not infrequently, you get somebody who seems to be afraid that being in a trance means to be out of control, not being able to do any more what he wants to do. So people may sit there and go like this with their hand or tap their foot. And you want to stop this. This of course makes trance induction more difficult. You want this to stop. When you don't say stop doing this with your hand, following Erickson, we say, and your left hand will continue to tap the table and tap the table, and that's quite all right. You see, the powerful thing that we can again take over immediately into genuine psychotherapy is that a prescribed resistance ceases to be resistance, it becomes compliance.
What was that sentence?
A prescribed resistance no longer is resistance. It ceases to be resistance, it becomes compliance. I remember a case, Erickson got a case of a man he described that one day a man came to see him who said, Dr. Erickson, I need hypnosis, I'm terribly nervous. In fact, I'm so nervous that I can't even sit down. I have to pace up and down. And Erickson said, that's quite all right. I want you to pace back and forth, and back and forth. And then he went into one of his long monologues. And then he suddenly interrupted himself and said, I know you're not going to sit down, but if you were to sit down, would you sit down in that chair or in this chair? And the patient made a mistake and said, in that chair. And within a minute, the patient was sitting in that chair. So, we can use this at all times. You see, we can use resistance in a positive way, especially with children it works. Rather than saying, don't do this. Say, there are certain children who have the habit of embarrassing their parents by screaming in public. The parents, of course, try to stop it. No. And the child screams even louder. If you can get parents to make a 180-degree turn and to tell the child, listen, yesterday you screamed much better than today. How come you don't scream as loud today as you screamed yesterday? You can almost be certain that if you can't get the parents to do such a totally irrational thing, you can almost be certain that the child would stop screaming. A prescribed resistance ceases to be resistance, it becomes compliance. Yes, please.
Is it possible to prescribe a resistance which is not so visible? It's more inner resistance.
Well, I don't know, maybe. Do you remember Viktor Frankl's concept of the paradoxical intention? He says that, you see, if you have I mentioned this briefly in my introduction, if you have a psychoneurotic problem, what you try to do is to dominate it somehow, to master it, effort of willpower. And all you get is more of the same. Because the more you try to repress this particular urge or fear or compulsion or whatever, the stronger it becomes. And the stronger it becomes, the more you try to repress it. So Frankl already 40 years ago talked about his paradoxical intention. He said, if, for instance, if I have a person who is in the presence of other people, he is very nervous, his hands are shaking. So he can't, for instance, drink a cup of coffee or light a cigarette. The person tries very hard to keep his hands steady. The more he tries, the shakier the hands become. So I don't know whether this is the kind of inner resistance that you think, that you mentioned. But Frankl then says, I want you to shake twice as hard on purpose. And in doing so, he creates a spontaneous paradox. He doesn't call it that way. He thinks it is some kind of neural inhibition. But I think I prefer Bateson's idea that this creates a spontaneous paradox. Because it is something spontaneous, and if I do it on purpose, it is no longer spontaneous. And this is the whole idea underlying this intervention that we call prescribing the resistance.
Would you say that this could be used with children that have attention deficit syndrome that's supposedly neurological?
I had no experience with this, but I could imagine that in addition to the neurological basis, there may be a superstructure of behavioral ingrained patterns. And I would have no doubt that something can be done. Another fortunate case that comes to my mind is occasionally I got a mother who brings in her child because the child doesn't eat. She's very worried the child doesn't eat. I look at the child and it seems normally fed, it doesn't seem terribly emaciated or something. So the mother explains what she's, I asked for the attempted solution, and the attempted solution is typically the mother cooks the kind of food that she believes that the child likes most. And then she takes the plate and heaps it with that particular food and gives it to the child. The child takes the fork and plays around a little bit, eats a little bit, and then doesn't eat anymore. The mother, of course, feels threatened in the second most important maternal function, feeding. And so if you can get the mother to follow the following prescription, you may be in business. But it's difficult. Again, it's a 180-degree turn. You get the mother to take an extra large plate and put a ridiculously small amount of a portion of food on it and give it to the child. And the child invariably asks, eats it and then says, why did you give me so little? And the mother is then supposed to say, I gave you as much as you always eat. Look, it's nonsense to have to throw away the rest. This is as much as you usually eat. And the child then immediately demands more, and she again gives him a tiny portion, and the child demands more. See, a prescribed resistance ceases to be a resistance. I think it might be a good moment to start drinking our coffee, all right? Unless you have some questions regarding this last point. Okay, is the confusion technique. The confusion technique is indicated where you are up against a person who may constantly interrupt you. You know, there are clients who don't let you finish a sentence. They already know what you are going to say and why you are going to say it, and they may be very critical of it already, etc. People who are very intellectualizing also fall into this category. But especially the people who think they have to be a step ahead of you or at least abreast of you, you know. So they cannot possibly stand the idea of a one-down position, listening to what the therapist has to say. We have the same thing in hypnosis, and these are people who are resisting the induction. Even though they want to be hypnotized for something, they still have some fears or something, I don't know. In any case, they interrupt and they talk and so on. In this case, in these cases, as I say, it is the confusion technique that appears to be indicated. It consists in creating a context in which the other person begins to wonder what on earth is this all about. Erickson was a master of it. Erickson would engage in long, complicated monologues about some absolutely trivial matter. He would, for instance, begin by saying, do you remember your 14th birthday? Well, who remembers her 14th birthday? No. But do you remember that on your 14th birthday, your 13th birthday was in the past, and your 15th birthday was in the future? Yes. Now, do you remember that by the time you were 15, your 13th birthday was in the past, and your 15th birthday was in the present? Uh-huh. People's eyes are beginning to get a little glassy. So he would engage in these long, complicated explanations and questions and so on. I remember another instance when he says, you see, I'm sitting here and you are sitting there. So my here is here, right? And my there is there. Uh-huh. Now, for you, it's different. For you, my here is your there. And my there is your here, is it not? The way we are constructed mentally, that first clear, understandable message that comes my way, I'm going to hold on to that lifesaver or something. So the confusion technique is immediately indicate where precisely we are up against this over-intellectualizing, I already know what you think and what you're going to say sort of attitude. There are in every language adjectives that are true of themselves and others that are not true of themselves. The word short is itself short, is it not? But the word long is not itself long. In fact, it is shorter than short. And the word Spanish is not Spanish, it is English. And the word Espanol is Spanish. As I say, in creating this kind of confusion, we all hold on for dear life to the first clear message that comes our way. So if you want to get a point across that you want to stick, use a little bit of the confusion technique. I can highly recommend it.
Do the clients never run out?
I'm sorry?
Do the clients never run out?
No. Because you are being very serious, you're being very courteous, and you try very hard to explain something. Except it's total nonsense.
Yes.
Then there is a technique called the worst fantasy technique. And I am not sure if it is an Ericksonian technique or maybe I'm megalomaniac or maybe I invented it myself. Be it as it may, what this technique is all about is the following. You may at times have the impression that there is a piece of vital information missing for your understanding of the situation you are trying to deal with. There is something there that they have not yet revealed. You can only speculate that maybe it is too painful, maybe it is too embarrassing, but you get these, the looks they give each other and their embarrassed behavior, you get an idea there is something. So, we were all, I guess I certainly was trained in that case to say, look, this is therapy, and in therapy one has to be open. How can I help you if you withhold information from me? That's perfect nonsense. What I like to do is something else. That's what I like to do. I say, if you were totally, irrationally, bizarrely pessimistic about your problem, what would you say? But I want you to give me some kind of a far out kind of fear or suspicion. But I insist that it must be illogical, irrational, bizarre. What would you say? And for a reason that I have not yet understood, it seems to be easier for people if you give them this enormous, endless space to begin to talk about the real thing that they are worried about. It also has the advantage that if they then come up with something that for them really was difficult to come up with, you can say, well, look, I asked you to be irrational. You're telling me something that is, of course, quite possible, yes, but I want you to be something totally bizarre. So you can, in a way, make it easier for them then to talk about this real thing. So I call this, or maybe Alison called this, the worst fantasy technique. And I can again highly recommend it. Yes, please.
When you receive that something that the person was hiding, you say that it's true, it's bizarre?
No.
Or you minimize it?
No. I say the opposite. I say, well, look, I've asked you to be irrational. You're telling me something that is quite believable. You know, suppose for a moment they say, who knows, we may divorce each other. And I said, well, come on, people get divorced all the time. I asked you to be irrational, please. Don't come up with something that possible. So I have, in a way, I have minimized what they thought was a horrible kind of a secret. And it becomes much more workable with as a result of it. Right. Let's see what I have next on my list. Well, a very complicated subject, the reframing. Reframing has been used in hypnosis for a long time. We are using it increasingly now also in systemic therapy. Reframing consists really in an attempt to create a change in the reality construction of a particular group of people, or even an individual. Reframing means to give the same reality of the first order a different meaning. In other words, to create a different reality of the second order. Remember I said that the reality of the first order is the reality as it is conveyed to us by our sense organs. But invariably, immediately, to these perceptions we add meaning, significance, value. And this is where human problems, of course, arise. So if you reframe successfully, it means you're giving the same reality, you're giving that reality of the second order a different kind of a meaning. The nicest example that I know of from the literature is that particular story in Tom Sawyer. Tom Sawyer has been punished. He has to paint a fence on a Saturday afternoon, and he's very worried about his friends who will come along and will tease him because he's being punished. So here you can see in the distance the one boy approaching who's teasing, he fears most. And as Mark Twain describes it, it's a marvelous idea. The boy approaches and Tom behaves as if he didn't see him, he's painting that fence. And the boy says, working, huh? And Tom turns around and says, oh, it's you, yeah. And then he goes on drinking. And the other boy begins to provoke him and says, wouldn't you rather come swimming with us? And Tom says, and at this time he goes on painting. Or would you rather work? The boy says. And Tom turns around again and says, work? What are you talking about? Does a boy get a chance to paint a fence every day? So he has totally reframed the punishment in a particular privilege. It's still the same reality of the first order, but now we're up against a very different reality of the second order. And as Mark Twain describes it, at the end of the afternoon, the fence has 3 coats of paint, and Tom is swimming in riches because every boy who came along paid him for the privilege of painting a part of the fence. You see, this is what the reframing is really about. Another example: a man is being held up in a dark alley by a man with a pistol, and the pistol asks for his wallet. Now here's again a situation in which there seem to be only 2 possibilities. Either you hand over the wallet and you lose your money, or you refuse to hand over your wallet and then you lose your money and your life. Now, I guess it presupposes nerves of steel, but still, one possibility of dealing with the situation would be to reframe it. And in this case, one possible reframing would be to say, for the man, for the victim to say, listen, I've been looking for somebody like you for a long time. I need somebody to bump off my wife's lover. You can force me to hand over my wallet, it contains $50. If you're interested in my proposition, come to my office tomorrow morning at 11. Let's discuss it. I'll pay you $5,000. Now, you see the same reality of the first order. A man who has money and doesn't want to lose it. A man who needs money and doesn't mind killing a person. But the meaning of the situation now is very, very different. There is no master in this kind of reframing. I repeat, it consists in giving the reality of the second order a different meaning. To change, therefore, the reality that the person has constructed for him, herself. It makes it bearable. If it is, of course, a positive reframing. Let me play to you now. I hope the sound is good enough, otherwise we can go on just verbally. Let me play to you an example taken out of a family therapy session where I attempt a reframing, and then John Weekland comes in and does it even much better than I do it. Very briefly, the situation is this. This is a family of, the hallucination is now reframed as an act, or an action, I should say, with a certain purpose. The question is no longer why do you think of Jesus Christ? Rather, what for? If you want to make people nervous and uneasy, then by all means say that you are Jesus Christ. Have I mentioned here, I really can't now remember that, with a young man who came to us for just one session, and have I mentioned this? All right. Now let me go on. In the same session then, the question again comes up. Can we now send Harold back to college? Parents do what, of course, they're likely to do. They watch the boy like hawks, and they thereby create a reality of the kind I mentioned in the introduction. If you carefully watch for even the slightest sign of mental disturbance, then any behavior may seem a sign of mental disturbance. Yeah. And Lane and Esterson, in their book on the families of schizophrenics, described this very, very nicely many years ago. They said, if the identified patient eats too much or too little, if he sleeps too much or too little, if he, etc., everything is sign of possible mental symptoms. So I am now going to try and reframe this by giving not a linguistic reframing, here I'm giving a behavioral reframing. I'm asking Harold, in the presence of the parents, to behave in a certain way. And I thereby managed, as the result showed later, next session, I managed to change this particular kind of problematic pattern. The situation. Yes, please.
Do you ask him if, to pay attention to see if his folks notice a change?
I mentioned later, I can put this on this composite tape, I mentioned later that if his parents, how did I put it? Yes, if he were to notice that his parents were too clever at discovering these things, he should then claim to have done certain things that they would consider to be signs of illness. I have therefore reinforced the situation, because now even if they were to see him act a bit strangely, they would have to think, oh, now he is pretending to be a bit happy.
You could also have asked him for more subtle ways of showing his safety.
Yes, I could have asked him not to make it so obvious that his parents can discover it. Yes, oh yes. Okay, let me give you another example of, this is already a bit more complex. Just to show you an intervention, it runs on 2 levels, but again, it attempts to change. Yes, please.
I'd like to ask you a question about the last one.
Yes.
Were the parents and the son both present when you...
Yes. Oh, no, that's important. Otherwise, the thing would, of course, be totally meaningless. No, the parents are there. And you heard me address them. I said, all of you, and so on. Now, in this case here, it's a single, it is family therapy, but at the distance of about 5,000 kilometers. Here is a young man who is himself about to become a therapist. He is at present in a moderately deep depression, because his marriage just broke up recently and he's a bit dissatisfied with his studies, and now the last thing that he comes in with is that his mother, he has just been told that his mother, who lives in New York, has been sent to a hospital for tests. And he of course wanted to know tests for what, and nobody in the family apparently could tell him, so he's very worried about what's the matter with his mother. I am now using his way. I'm now suggesting to him a way of dealing with his mother's fear, that at the same time I hope he will carry over to his own depression. So his attempted solution would now be to call up the mother in the hospital and cheer her up. That is precisely what he's trying to do to himself, and this is precisely what he has been told he should do. He got this well-meant advice from his human environment, come on, cheer up, it isn't so bad, one gets over the divorce, and you will see in a few weeks you will feel very differently. And let me only repeat that if you ever were even mildly depressed and you got up against this, and people, kind-hearted people told you these very things, you may have noticed what it does. You go deeper and longer into depression. So my attempt in the case of depression is always to do the opposite. So, but here in this case, I have this marvelous opportunity not to give, talk about his own depression, but I'm going to talk about his mother's depression and the way he's trying to deal with it. And as you will hear, I asked him what does he plan to do, and as I said, he's trying to call her and cheer her up. So let me play this first part. Thinking about his own depression in a similar, different way. I wanted to get him to stop telling himself that he shouldn't feel the way he felt. And there was a marvelous occasion to have him experience the result of it through the application of the same method with his mother. So this was really a fairly obvious turning point in this man's therapy. Now, I don't know whether you would it be all right if I went on with a few more examples. Let me, sorry?
He's not going to have his mother react.
His mother became, he said she was her voice sounded very faint, she seemed at death's door, and so he begins to tell her how miserable he feels. And death's door opened and she came running out and her voice became increased by 10 times and she began, she was alive and began to give him advice, which was exactly of course what I had hoped for. But in having this effect with his mother, you know, it must have left him also with an idea about to deal with his own depression. Stop cheering himself up or stop telling himself that he has no right and no reason to feel the way he felt, etc., etc., etc. So, here would be a form of reframing. The opposite of reframing is called the illusion of alternatives. John Weekland, John Jackson wrote an article about this a long time ago. And the illusion of alternatives. While in the case of reframing, you clearly open up a person's view of the availability of other ways of dealing with the problem. While in the reframing, you lead a person out of the seeming unchangeability of the suchness of his reality construction. In the case of the illusion of alternatives, you do the opposite. You create a blindness for alternatives. Erickson remembers that as a small boy already he had to help his father on the father's ranch, and the father had a weird way of getting the little Milton to do his work. He would ask him, for instance, do you want the chicken, do you want to feed the chickens or the pigs first? It creates the illusion of an alternative, the illusion of free choice. The little word first is the trap. Because he had to do both things anyway, and his only freedom was to decide which of the two he wants to do first. But it sounds different. It impresses people differently. The worst application, of course, of this kind of a technique is in commercials and in propaganda. Propaganda is a process of communication that creates blindness for existing alternatives. That is the whole point of propaganda. I remember back in 1942, when things began to get bad for the Germans, they put up posters, the Nazis put up posters all over occupied Europe, and the posters read simply, National Socialism or Bolshevik chaos, question mark. The implication clearly was, you have to decide between these two things. And clearly every decent person will opt for the shining National Socialism and reject diabolic Bolshevism, right? This was a clear illusion of alternatives, because both, of course, are totalitarian, both systems are inhuman, and the real alternative is between totalitarian forms of government and democracy. But precisely, you see, propaganda tries to create this blindness. It creates an illusion of alternatives. Resistance groups somewhere, I don't know where, prepared little stickers and stuck them up to these posters, and the little sticker read, spuds or potatoes, question mark. And this created a vast Gestapo search for perpetrators of this ideological crime. So, this is the essence of the illusion of alternatives. It is useful at times, I've mentioned so far only negative applications. It can be used occasionally for positive purposes. Take the case of a child who every evening creates a terrible fuss when he has to go to bed. Screams and wants to stay up longer, etc. One application of the illusion of alternatives, this is again an example from Erickson, is to ask the child, do you want to go to bed tonight at 8 or at 8:15? It creates a seeming freedom of choice. Let me avoid this. Or, would you like to put your pajamas on right now or in the bathroom? An illusion of alternatives. Let me go on and play you some more examples of a more general nature, just to show some of the concepts that we have elaborated. Here is an example taken from Ronald Lang in London. He had a session with a family in the hospital, a family, and their hospitalized 18-year-old son who was diagnosed as schizophrenic. Forgive me if I'm not quite at the beginning of the example, because as you know, the foot count is always different on different machines. But in any case, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's right. The example starts where the just after the patient has said that has accused himself of being selfish and ungrateful, and the psychiatrist asks the patient what he means by this, and the example starts precisely where the patient explains. I hope I'm there, but I haven't given you examples. This is a mother who comes to see us for a somewhat unlikely problem of no great clinical importance, as you will see. She has received a call from her son's teacher. The son, Danny, is 8 years old. He's now going to second grade, and it is November. And the mother has asked him repeatedly, "How come I never see you do any homework? How come you don't do any homework?" And the child sort of blithely said every time, "Oh no, this year's teacher doesn't give us any homework." And now the mother has received a call from the teacher who is asking, why doesn't Danny ever bring his homework to school? Now the mother is upset, because not so much because the child has been lying to her, but the mother is a modern mother, and that's her problem. And she thinks that if she were a better mother than she is, she would know how to awaken within her child the spontaneous wish to do his homework. So listen to her explain the problem. It's a long monologue. Classically, paradoxes in formal logic. For instance, the liar who says of himself, "I'm lying." I want him to be spontaneous. It is not enough for her to say, "I want him to do his homework." No, I want him to want to do his homework. All right. Before she came to the second session, the teacher had called again, and with trepidation apparently had asked the mother, "Mrs. Brown, could you perhaps tell Danny to do his homework?" And with this educational authority behind her, she told the child that he had to do his homework, otherwise he couldn't go play. And to her enormous surprise, he sat down and did his homework. End of the case. The briefest brief therapy case that we have had at MRI. The behavior prescription came from the teacher. So these were two examples of attempted solutions. All right, now one that already has an element of interaction, of therapeutic intervention in it. It is a young airline flight assistant, or they used to call them stewardesses. She is stationed in San Francisco, and she flew over to Asia, which meant that she was usually away for 5 or 6 days. And when she came back to San Francisco, she then had 3 or 4 days totally free. Like so many well put together depressed people, she functioned very well in the structure of her job. But those 3 days in San Francisco were a real problem for her. She sat in her little apartment and stared at the wall or at television, which is really the same thing, and smoking innumerable cigarettes. And you can imagine everybody who knew her gave her the same kind of well-meant advice. Come on, you live in a fascinating city, look how beautiful the weather is, and you are young, intelligent, attractive, go out, get involved, do something. And that's exactly poison for anybody who is down. So she comes to see us, she's being seen by a Stanford psychiatry resident who is doing his elective with us. She has just explained this problem, and we have reason to believe that the young resident is about to say, why don't you, etc. So John Wickland, who sits at that moment, sits closest to the door, jumps up and runs in and drops a bomb. And you will hear what he says. You hear him come in and then say something. I apologize for the bad quality of this example. I'll switch to some other interventions. This is the case of a similar mild to moderate depression in a young lady of about 28 years who is suffering from a disease that is endemic, especially in California. She is longing for a deep, meaningful relationship. and she's taking this so seriously that she only works half-time because she doesn't want to waste too much time looking for this marvelous man. And by her own description, what happens over and over and over again is that she runs into somebody who seems a nice young man. They may have a cup of coffee together, or they may have dinner together, or they may spend the night together, but invariably, every time, the man never calls back. It just disappears. Which leaves her with one and only one conclusion, that there's something so horrible about her that anybody who comes to know her, even superficially, turns away in disgust. So she goes into a moderate depression, and after 2 or 3 weeks she crawls out of the hole and she does the same thing over again. So in listening to her, it becomes clear that what we need to do first of all is to stop doing this kind of repetitious self-defeating behavior. And the way Lynn Siegel is the therapist, and what we decide is that we're going to ask her to do something that is very indicated also for people who are convinced that they are always the center of everybody's attention. You will hear that the therapist, the therapist asks her to stay home, because by going out and looking for this marvelous relationship, she is not paying sufficient attention to what goes on inside her. She should stay home and allow this feeling of longing to build up until it becomes better understandable to her. And he then says, and if the feeling where this need to go out became overwhelming, then you must promise us that you will leave the house with some kind of imperfection. For instance, with 2 different shoes on, or with a smudge of black oil on your face. Pretend that you don't know that you have this streak of oil on your face. This is, as I said, this is the part that can very usefully be also applied to people who have this excessive idea of their own, of being the center of everybody's attention. So she later replies there was no need to use this blemish. But for instance, to go out with 2 different shoes, I mean, people who think they are constantly observed and judged by others may find it very strange that nobody may say a word. Nobody seems to notice that they have a black and a gray shoe on. And the instructions are, if somebody were to say, how come you wear 2 different colored shoes? they are then to answer, yes, and you know the funny thing is I have another player just like this at home. So here, here she comes back and she reports, it's 2 weeks later, she reports on the success of the intervention. That we published, but it sounds more interesting if you hear it, more believable. This is a young graduate student who is about to get his PhD. He has fulfilled all the course requirements, but he has not yet submitted his dissertation. And if you have a déjà vu or think you have a déjà vu experience, you are wrong. He's not the typical student who can't be finished. No, he is, if anything, the very opposite. He is an excessively compulsive, perfectionistic worker. He has been writing on his thesis on his dissertation for about 2 years. It is August. The university in Berkeley has given him until the 15th of December to submit his dissertation, otherwise he's out. He has so far written 3 of the 8 chapters that his dissertation is supposed to comprise, and these 3 chapters already amount to 400 typewritten pages. He is totally, his attempted solution, or his delusion, is that he has to write a thesis, a dissertation that absolutely has no mistake and nothing incomplete in it. There must be nothing in it that his dissertation committee could possibly criticize. And so he writes a half page, let's say, and then in rereading the half page, he realizes that, I better put in a footnote here, and in trying to formulate the footnote, it occurs to him to read yet another book. And then he finds out, in that book, there are 2 more authors that he hasn't mentioned yet. And this is how the thing explodes. He is married, they don't have children yet. They're both very charming, very intelligent young people. She is helping him, she's very much involved. She goes to the library, gets the books, she does the final draft on the typewriter, the final version on the typewriter, etc., etc. So clearly something needs to be done to get him off this attempted solution of his. And John Wickland is the therapist, and he has tried just about every intervention we know that could be tried under these circumstances, and nothing has worked. He takes a certain delight to come back and say, yes, I did it, but it didn't help. Even though, very often he has slightly misunderstood it or has left out something. So he's also playing the game of defeating the expert. At a given moment, John goes on a week's vacation, so I'm the designated therapist to do this one session. This is very simple because in the Brief Therapy Center, every one of us follows every case, so that every one of us can take over exactly where the case stands. And it has occurred to me that this man comes to the therapy session always very, very neatly dressed. And so I think maybe if I can get him to soil himself, make himself a little dirty, maybe this will diminish his perfectionism. But unfortunately his wife tells me that, oh no, at home he's quite a slob. And here my last hope seems to be going, and then I have my annual brainwave. And I gave this man a behavior prescription. I don't have to tell you what it is because he's not going to tell you how it went, and in doing so he will also mention what I asked him to do. And let me mention, yes, I'm asking him to go out and to make himself mildly ridiculous, to make himself look mildly foolish, somewhere where he never needs to go back to, with people whom he doesn't know, just in a very mild way to make himself look foolish. And he wants to know what I have in mind. Can I give him an example? And I said, well, for instance, drive to a place in Berkeley from where you can see both bridges, the Golden Gate Bridge in the distance and the Bay Bridge coming over from San Francisco, and stop somebody, point to the Golden Gate Bridge and say, this is the Bay Bridge, isn't it? Now, every child, of course, knows that the name of the two bridges, needless to say. So, it wasn't just my brilliance. I think it was because time was running out, and the 10th session was approaching, and he had not yet had any noticeable success. So this time he's carried out the instruction, and this is how he reports it. If very rapidly, in the course of a few days, between one session and the next. You might say, haha, but still, insight was the decisive factor. I began to connect all of this up to my past and my childhood and so on. And I realized I'm taking myself too seriously. And I would say, oh no. Here, the insight, if you want to call it that, came after acting, after doing something. It was insight, if you want to call it insight. It would have been unimportant whether he had the insight, whether he connected it up to his past, whether he realized that this is how he had been acting so far. The important thing is that he was out of his trap, of his perfectionism. This is what Hans von Förster, our great mentor, the fourth person who greatly influenced this in our thinking here, this is what he means with his ethical imperative. Von Förster's ethical imperative is, if you want to see, learn how to act. While in traditional therapy it's the other way around. If you want to act differently, you must first have insight. And here's an example that this can be. This is simply not so. I don't think I have ever in my life changed, even in the smallest way, as a result of insight. I changed because somehow acted differently. Something occurred that made me now see, oh, there's another possibility. In a follow-up interview, it turned out that he had indeed been able to submit his dissertation by the 15th of December. It had been accepted, and he was a PhD by then. In the year, 2 or 3 years later, he sent us his first book, which was that dissertation that had been made in the book form, into a book. So, any questions, please?
Would you have continued to be very tentative about the results that he brought back and suggest that he might get worse later on?
Oh yes, no, we did this. I mean, routinely. I'm not sure now, did I mention this, that routinely when somebody comes back and reports success, we are rather pleased, but then we immediately become skeptical. Please, there is now a horrible mistake that you can commit, that you are probably going to commit, the mistake of believing that your problem is now resolved. People don't change that quickly. You are bound to have a relapse. And the relapse may be already before our next session. Let's therefore discuss in all detail, please, how you are most likely to fall back into the old pattern. What would you have to do to make it certain that you will fall back into the old pattern? And we insist on discussing all possible relapses. Because this is the best way I know of fortifying, of cementing therapeutic gain, is to insist on a relapse. Because a relapse that has been discussed in all detail is much less likely to occur. This is incidentally the idea that my book, How to Make it, in English it's The Situation is Hopeless but Not Serious, is based on. It is one long series of advice what to do in order to make yourself miserable. And people have written to me, they said this book is helpful because it shows me what I've been doing so far. But let me point to the importance of this intervention that says, what would you have to do to ruin things again, to destroy the change that has already occurred. This is of great importance. This is also very useful not only with a couple. This was a couple. She was present. She didn't speak up in this brief part I showed you. But especially the families, they come back and say, "Oh, I had a fairly good week." When we would then ask every single family members, what would you have to do? Or what would father have to do? What would your mother have to do to make things again as bad as they were a week ago? And believe me, it is a powerful deterrent, I would almost say. It gets people off this tendency then to fall right back into where they were before. Yes?
Could you explain to me the dynamics of the graduate student who's depressed, who calls his mother, and that interaction, how it affects his recovery?
Well, he was doing the same thing to himself that he was going to do with his mother. He was going to call her and cheer her up. And cheering up means you are wrong if you feel badly, because things aren't so bad as you think they are. So I'm asking him to do the very opposite with his mother. In obtaining a positive result, the mother suddenly cheering up when she hears about his own misery, cannot have left him without thinking, wait a moment, there is something that I'm doing to myself, that I was just about going to do with my mother. And with her it had this remarkable result. Have I answered your question?
I have to write that down, because it sounds like it must be.
Yes, please.
How did you obtain the generalization of this freedom and ease of small foolishness in the last case? How do you generalize that to the thesis, to the dissertation?
It was in the framework of his dissertation that he did most of this perfectionistic kind of, like it has to be just perfect sort of thing. So I got him to try out imperfection in a totally removed, irrelevant context. I made it very clear. Drive to some place where you needn't ever go back to, and do something to people whom you don't know. Do it in a very, very small way. And sometimes, we ask people to go to the post office and ask the men, do they have any round stamps?
But how did you sell that to him? That he would agree to be foolish in any context?
I don't quite remember what kind of rationalization I used. Sometimes, I don't give an explanation at all. Sometimes I merely say, the proof of the pudding lies in eating. I wanted to do this. And there's no point in us discussing it here, because you have to do it in order to find out what we have in mind. I remember a young professor here from Stanford came to me. He lived alone, and one evening he had been to, it was already dark at 6 o'clock in the winter, and he had gone to a supermarket to buy his food. And while in this huge, well-lit place full of hundreds of people, he had a sort of an unpleasant sensation of anxiety. It wasn't strong enough to keep him from buying his things and paying and leaving. But he had this idea, is this going to repeat itself? And with this anticipatory anxiety, of course, the next time he went, it hit him. He felt so full of anxiety that he could not make his purchases. He had to leave immediately. So he comes, and he says to me, this happens occasionally, I read all your books. I know all your tricks. Can you help me? I said, well, the fact that you have read all my books is, if anything, is a great advantage, because you will not be surprised at what I'm going to ask you to do. So I asked him to go back to that supermarket. The session ended at 6 o'clock, it was dark. Go right back there to that market, go in, and stop 1 yard short of the point where your anxiety would overtake you. And he comes back to the next station and says it worked. I'm now walking to the supermarket and I'm pushing a safety zone of 1 yard ahead of me. Now, you see, you can give rather inane, almost asinine instructions to even very sophisticated people like him. You have reframed, I have, in this case, reframed the situation.
It's kind of confronting your own worst fears. I was in a treatment center once where, since I was very perfectionistic, they wouldn't let me, they told me that I had to be as messy looking as I possibly could. No makeup, and I could not comb my hair, and it just about killed me. But after a while, people would say, gee, you look better without makeup on than you do with it on. Okay, but it did. I'm not nearly as perfectionistic as
No.
Sure felt good to put makeup back on, though.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is time to think of metabolism.